And I want to, I guess it did it. Let's see. Yep, let's do it. Always like to try it. I would like to introduce our speaker tonight. Her name is Judit Green, and I love this title she has: Texas Parks and Wildlife Urban Biologist. Because our urban areas, you know, most of our people live in urban areas now, and a lot of them don't know what to do with wildlife. So part of Judith's job is to help people do that, and she's been doing that for 27 years. And she's only 29 years old. I don't know how she could do that. She offers technical guidance on natural resource projects that benefit wildlife, landscapes, water, and people. And she was one of the co-founders of the first chapter of Texas Master Naturalists. That's the founding chapter in the Alamo area. And we're really glad you guys did that. It's wonderful. And she still advises the chapter. She was a contributing author to Texas Wildscapes, Gardening for Wildlife book. She supports Texas Children in Nature, which is a wonderful organization that connects families to nature. And she's a big supporter of the Alamo Area Monarch Collaborative, which promotes pollinator plants and create habitats for all wildlife. Because we know that a lot of the plants will help a lot of different wildlife. And she's the perfect person tonight to help us turn a part of our property into a garden that encourages a variety of wildlife to visit. And it doesn't use a lot of water, and it doesn't use any chemicals. That's the good news. We can make, I love this, we can make a big difference in a small urban lot to benefit wildlife, to add beauty to our property and create something positive for our environment. So I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to ask Judith to share her screen.
All right, can everyone?
Okay, Judith, we need to go into presentation.
Yeah, it's just taking for some reason. There we go. I think that's it.
Yes, beautiful.
Okay. Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me tonight. I'm going to be talking about how we hopefully can create some habitat in our cities. And I am located here in San Antonio. I'm one of two urban biologists here in San Antonio. And before I get started, I did want to mention a few of the little websites here that you see on the main screen. NatureRocksTexas.org is a website that allows a lot of our partner organizations here in the Bexar County and surrounding area contribute any kind of activities, outdoor activities, nature-related activities that they are offering on this particular website, so that people either visiting our city and or county can see what's happening on any given weekend or week, and or also our local residents can find out what is happening locally. And the center image there is the Monarch Champion City image, and San Antonio still is a Monarch Champion City, meaning that we have taken on, the past two mayors, Ivy and Nuremberg, have taken on the challenge of being a Monarch Champion City, in that we are trying to make sure that our city, as well as our residents, are empowered to hopefully help the monarch, which is on the decline dramatically. And of course, when we have something like a monarch that is kind of our ambassador, if you will, for a lot of our pollinators, people are willing to do things for the monarch. And as a result, of course, when they are doing good things on their property for the monarch, they are also helping all pollinators. And then, of course, as I'll be talking here in a bit, you'll also realize that not only are we helping other pollinators, but we're also helping all wildlife, including even ourselves. And of course, our Parks and Wildlife website has some information as well. I do have my email up here if you want to take a snapshot of this particular screen, so that way you have my phone number as well, and or email. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me in either fashion, either on my work cell or on my email. All right, so here Texas, we of course have, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing some of my slides. Let me see if I can reduce this a little bit. Maybe not. Okay, for some reason. All right, anyway, so essentially we are a state that has a ton of people living in it. We have probably close to 30 million with our new census count that's probably coming out, well over 30 million probably, that will be on the 2020 census. And of course, now we're probably at a much higher percentage rate, but many of these Texans that live here are in urban areas. So you can see some of the major hubs here, and I'll try and point it out with my arrow. Of course, the Dallas-Fort Worth area up north, San Antonio, Austin, Houston, of course, and El Paso in the far west. But when you see all these little dots, you can see that we definitely are very concentrated in the eastern half of our state, for sure. And unfortunately, what that means is we just really don't have a lot of habitat residing in our urban areas. And the more we are developing, the more we're seeing a lot of that habitat being destroyed. And it is somewhat of a depressing thought when you think about the fact that, you know, we will continue to be urbanizing a lot of our communities. However, that's probably one of the main reasons when I talk to groups, I really want to encourage people to focus on what they can do in their backyards, because we all have an urban lot if you live in a city. And many of us also may even be absentee landowners, in the sense that we may have inherited some property, or we're purchasing some small tract of land because we want a small piece of rural pie here in Texas that we feel that we can just love and be out in nature in. The downside is, unfortunately, that, of course, I know I'm speaking to the choir in that many of you probably are very well aware of the value of habitat, but a lot of times when you're speaking to other audiences, whether it's your friends, your family members, it's so important to share this knowledge that you have with them, to inform them and remind them that a lot of that habitat on these rural pieces of property, of course, you know, if it's removed in a given weekend, you know, it'll take years to come back. And we ultimately need to make sure that even if we just have a small piece of urban lot, we can make a huge difference for a lot of our pollinators. And we may not be able to have deer, which most of us probably already have anyway. If you're in a city, you probably don't want to have more deer on your property. But again, you know, we can also, of course, have birds. Birds are vital as well. And they are good residents in urban areas because of the fact that they don't have any boundary limitations. So they can come and go freely. So what we do in our backyards really can benefit a lot of our birds as well, in addition to the pollinators. So because they're flying, typically, in most cases, they can come and go readily. So when Parks and Wildlife first started the Urban Wildlife Program back in the early 90s, we emulated a program from the National Wildlife Federation, a Texas Wildscapes program, which focused on trying to encourage a lot of our 30 plus million now in Texas to do things to essentially either keep some of the valuable habitat that they had in their backyards, or put back some of the valuable habitat that was once there before developers removed a lot of it. And so we wanted to empower a lot of these residents to put back some of that valuable habitat in the form of various native plants. Most people who aren't natural gardeners oftentimes really don't know what to put in the yard. And so that's really the big, probably the biggest disconnect that I have seen in a lot of my talks. People want to do the right thing, but they don't know what to do. They go to their local nursery and they find a lot of non-native plants in these local nurseries, kind of box store nurseries. But they don't realize that there are specialty nurseries here, even in our own communities, that do carry more in the way of natives. And so it's just very important to make sure that they also realize where those resources are, so they can visit those nurseries and try to get some of the native plants to restore onto their property. Most areas, and I apologize, I don't know why this is, oh, I can move it, awesome. That helps tremendously. Then I can actually see what I'm looking at. So most urban landscapes, of course, look like this. There's a vast array of turf grass in our communities. Most of it's been removed, and people, again, don't know what to plant, so they just put in grass. It's kind of the standard protocol, what many of us have grown up with and what continues in most urban settings. So this is where we really need to make some changes, because there's a large amount of acreage that really is underutilized, that could be restored into native habitat. And of course, when you think about it, when you think of the big picture, it can be sometimes very overwhelming. However, if we are each just focused on our small little piece of property, it's definitely more doable. And, again, it's just a matter of hopefully encouraging maybe your neighbors. And believe it or not, we have heard this story many times where one person does some amazing things on their very own property and neighbors start asking questions. Oh, I love that plant. What is that? They can see examples of the native plants that someone may be planting on their front yard. And of course, because it brings in a ton of pollinators, a ton of hummingbirds and butterflies, people are enthralled with the notion of, oh, first of all, it looks gorgeous. It enhances property value. And of course, people want to emulate that as well on their own property because they enjoy being surrounded by beauty and a lot of these flying creatures that we love to have nearby. So one thing that I just recently learned, and I feel like we all can learn things no matter how long you've been doing whatever it is you're doing. Oh goodness, let's see, why is now my slide is stuck? Sorry about this. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm sorry about that. So one of the things that I recently learned from Doug Talame, he's a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. I heard one of his talks, and I would highly encourage you, if you have not listened to him, Google him in YouTube. He has numerous talks with different organizations. If you have not already had him come speak, he might even be willing to come speak to Bear Audubon. But in any case, there are a lot of presentations already pre-recorded and you can listen in on his talks. But I had not heard him speak until about a year and a half ago. And that was the first time I realized, some of the information that he was talking about just he gathered this data that more or less showed that up to about 600 million acres of land in our urban areas are really kind of unused space. And some of that space comes from urban centers, of course, our downtown areas, the suburbia, pretty much the areas where most of subdivisions occur. This also entails backyards, businesses, schools, and then of course exurbia, which is kind of outer area outside of suburbia, and then our very rural residential areas even oftentimes are cleared. And so that's really the downside, is that all these properties sometimes are cleared because people aren't aware of what they should have on their property. They don't recognize the plants. Things look too weedy and messy, and that's not what they grew up with, especially those absentee landowners that move out into rural properties. And that's what's really detrimental, because oftentimes, I don't know how many times I've shown up at an event and they see my Parks and Wildlife logo and they're like, oh, I'm so glad you're here. We just cleared our land last weekend and now we'd love to do something for birds. And I'm like, oh my God, and my heart literally breaks when I hear that, because of course they now are going to have to start over if they really want to do something for birds. So, but anyway, rural residential areas, as I mentioned, golf courses, power lines and pipeline right-of-ways. That's what ROW stands for, and railroad right-of-ways. These are all valuable properties that oftentimes just get mowed repeatedly over and over again, and the forbs or wildflowers aren't allowed to come up to benefit a lot of our pollinators, which in turn benefit a lot of the other things that we love, other wildlife species that we love, and the very landscapes that we love. So without pollinators, and I think most of you probably know this, but it's definitely worth reiterating, essentially we would not have the beautiful surrounding landscapes that we enjoy in Texas and in our nation and in the world. About 90% of our plants are pollinated by pollinators. So that of course would mean that a lot of what we see surrounding us would go away. In addition, a lot of the food that we eat, of course, every third bite, they say, you can thank a pollinator for. So again, agricultural crops are very valuable. So the main thing that Doug Talame really highlighted to me was that, you have all this acreage. And of course, Parks and Wildlife, we have historically ignored urban areas. And that's why the urban program kind of came into fruition back in the 90s, because we realized that a lot of our urban residents were absentee landowners. And of course, we also realized there was some value in urban areas too, because we wanted to ensure that some of that land got converted. So we're all kind of on the same if you will, ship. We're all trying to spread the word. And of course, we definitely want to make sure that people understand the value of urban areas, which historically have always been overlooked. Prior to the 90s, people, really just didn't think much about it. But now that we're seeing moving forward that they just are continuously expanding. I mean, when you drive from Austin to San Antonio, you can hardly see a break in the landscape. It's all very much urbanized along I-35. So again, very important. But that 600 million acres of land that occurs within the urban areas in our nation, that's bigger than essentially Texas and 10 other states that are highlighted on the bottom of the screen now, combined. So Texas is huge. And then of course, California, Montana, Oklahoma, Florida, Georgia, those are also huge states. So when you think about all that land, that is really part of our urban systems. That's enormous. I mean, that just, to me, that was the one thing that kind of shocked me. I had not really thought about it in that manner. And so I think it's just even more crucial that we highlight our urban areas and realize that we as residents and homeowners, we have the power to really make some huge change. And it's important that we do that. Moving forward. So again, sharing this knowledge with your family and friends that may not be linked to some of this basic knowledge that many of you are aware of already is also very important. So as I mentioned, Parks and Wildlife did originally create a program that emulated the National Wildlife Federation's program, the Backyard Habitat Program. National Wildlife started it in the 1970s, and Parks and Wildlife decided to take that program with the blessing of National Wildlife Federation. And we also wanted to make sure that homeowners that lived in the San Antonio, or excuse me, in Texas would have a plant list that was appropriate for Texans. And so the only downside with the National Wildlife Federation plant list was it focused a lot on the Northeast. It was very detailed for Northeastern section of the US with the plant list. But as it expanded kind of westward and southward, their plant list wasn't quite as defined for our state. And so we really wanted to make sure that our Texas residents had some good information. I will tell you that Parks and Wildlife no longer does certification of backyards, but the National Wildlife Federation still does that. If you want to get your yard certified, if you're doing some really good things on your property, that sign can oftentimes be a really good way to share what you're doing with your neighbors that may be walking the neighborhood that you may not even know. So again, that signage can be very helpful to kind of get that word out. I just also went ahead and posted Bringing Nature Home, the book that Doug Tallamy first wrote back in 2007, because it is a really good read. And so again, there's a lot of good information out there, and I'm going to try and share a lot of that with you. But I will tell you the Texas Wildscapes program, when Texas Parks and Wildlife first started the program in the 90s, we really just wanted to make sure that residents in urban areas knew that, of course, first and foremost, if you have something of value, you want to retain it. Just because you don't know what those plants are, we definitely want to make sure that they're not removed. And then unfortunately, people, again, clear things that they later find out may have been very valuable. And it can sometimes take years for some of the more substantial plants like trees and larger shrubs to grow back. So retain what you have first and live with it. And I usually tell people to live with it at least a year. I really encourage almost like 3 years, because sometimes it can take you a little bit longer to really identify what you have on your property, and things start to come up that may have maybe during construction are starting to come back. So you want to really kind of learn what you have on your property. And I'll touch a little bit on how you can do that here in just a second if you're not a good plant person and you really don't know your plants that well. But of course, if you have nothing on your property other than turf grass, then that's really where we want you to convert your property back into what may have been on your property, depending on what ecoregion you live here in Texas. And within Bexar County, even, we have 4 ecoregions, and I'll highlight those in just a second. But if you can, it is important to try to figure out what ecoregion you are in so you can recognize what kind of soil type you have. And then put those native plants that are appropriate for your ecoregion onto your property for the most success in allowing those plants to thrive. And it doesn't take much. If you put the right plant in the right soil, then really just a little bit of watering and a little bit of watching. Once they are in the ground, most native plants really thrive. Of course, we would encourage you, if you can, to restore your property with mostly native plants. When we did our Wildscapes program, we used to ask that at least half of the property be in native plants. But again, we understand that some people like to have their favorites that are not necessarily from here, as long as they're not considered invasive species. We definitely want to deter individuals from putting those types of plants into our urban areas, and especially on rural properties where they can really start kind of escaping, if you will, to other natural areas. And of course, when you do a wildscape, what you're doing when you're developing your property for wildlife in urban areas is you're just providing them the basics, and that is just providing the food, providing cover, providing nesting opportunities. And those three, of course, are provided by the types of plants you put in the ground on your property. And then ultimately adding a component of water kind of rounds everything out so that you have a well-balanced ecological site where wildlife can thrive and you can watch them enjoy your gardens. So again, we also want to try and have individuals look at when the plants that you're putting onto your ground, when do they bloom? That really is very important for a lot of our pollinators. And again, remember, pollinators are crucial for the basic foundation of all wildlife because again, they provide and they pollinate a lot of the plants that the other wildlife, if you love birds, if you love mammals, if you love reptiles, those other groups of wildlife, in order for them to have their habitat, the pollinators have to pollinate the very plants that they may be using. So that's why it's crucial to make sure that you are providing nectaring plants and that you're providing things that either offer some type of food source year round. And so, we typically say for pollinators, especially if you can have about 3 to 4 pollinating plants during each season, that is a great way to get started. So focus when you're looking at plant lists that I'll be sharing with you as well. Try to look for, picking maybe 3 plants that bloom in the spring, 3 plants that bloom in the summer and then fall, and even kind of in the winter months. Winter months aren't really true. I mean, December, we still have things blooming, and believe it or not, things start blooming as early as February. So that those 2 months are kind of part of that winter month period. That's a little bit harder, but still, again, there are some plants that will bloom in those tail ends of that season here in Texas. And then of course, if you can simulate natural habitats nearby, ideally that would be great. And by that, I also mean offering that vertical layering. So many of us have canopy trees, and we may have ground covers, but we're missing that mid-level layer section. And that is really where you have small to medium to large shrubs. So that fills in the gap in the middle. And that's especially important for birds. So having that filled in, if you will, with native plants will definitely round things out. I do list the wildflower.org website. They do have a great collection of plant lists, and it ranges from pollinator plant lists to the Wildscape plant list to, again, a whole array of different collections of plant lists that I would highly encourage you to visit and kind of check out to see if there's something that draws you in. But the nice thing about the wildflower.org, it is, of course, in Austin, based in Austin. The Wildflower, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Research Center is based in Austin. They offer a lot of classes as well, but their database is amazing, and it's amazing for Texas, and it's also nationwide, excuse me. So even if you're if you have property out of state, you can definitely use that website as a means of finding good native plant data for your state.
Judith, before you move on,
Yes, ma'am.
I had a couple of questions here in the chat that had to do with this slide, if you'd like to deal with those now. The 50% native plants, is that figure by area or some other measure?
Essentially just, and again, this was when we used to certify, that was our minimum recommendation. So if you had 10 plants, 5 of them had to be native. So,
Okay.
but ideally, again, it's sometimes hard to find native plants, but we would definitely encourage you to, again, retain first and foremost. And if you have to plant some additional plants on your property, just try to find native to the area where you reside and plant those on your property.
Okay, and the other question was, someone has a sign, we have one too, that's over 10 years old and it's all faded out. How do we get a new one?
Well, unfortunately, if it's from Texas Parks and Wildlife, we are no longer certifying. So you would have to go through the National Wildlife Federation and
Okay.
get a sign, which you can see here. It's the one pictured on this particular slide. And you would
Thank
just go to nwf.org and
Okay.
you can purchase one of their signs. And or you would have to probably get certified
Yeah,
unless
you
you were
just have
double.
to fill out a little form. It's
Yes.
not, okay. And we'll come back to some other questions later.
Okay. So essentially, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I just wanted to highlight this in the sense that this is kind of an image that showcases actually birds. On the left, you see the different birds that typically use these different canopy layers. Excuse me, just layers in general. There's an overstory canopy, which is really most of your larger trees. They have the canopy part of their tree, of course. It's usually used by flycatchers and hawks, for example. Then underneath those canopy trees, that's the layer that oftentimes is missing, that understory canopy. And that oftentimes means that if you don't have that, you won't maybe have owls or jays or kinglets, woodpeckers, chickadees, and nuthatches. So that may be a missing component. If you start adding those medium to medium to tall shrubs and maybe even small trees, small ornamental trees, you're filling in that understory layer that really will bring in some additional birds. And then, of course, the shrub layer, some of us have that, and that's typically, for goldfinches and hummingbirds. And then our ground layer, as you can see, for song sparrows, thrushes, wrens, and towhees, and so forth. So again, these different layers oftentimes are used by different birds. So the more diversity you have on your property, typically the more wildlife you'll be able to sustain and attract. But something that was also very interesting to me was that when I listened to Doug Talame speak, he was also talking about the use of caterpillars by a lot. Of course, we all know that birds need insects when they're in the breeding stage and they're feeding their young. Very important. And there was a research project that he noted in his presentation that I had not heard of before. And it was one where they focused on different birds and how many caterpillars these birds were using to feed their young. And I was shocked by the answer, actually. And I will be highlighting that. I'm a little bit premature here. I want to wait before I highlight that, but I just want you to get thinking about that. But again, this is Nature's Best Hope. This is his most recent book that was printed back in 2020. Another good book and good read to get some great information if you would like to really dive into the subject. But this image right here, of course, is one that is just a yard that really is sterile. There's nothing here of value. And of course, we would like to think that, we could have something more along this line where, I think all of us would enjoy hanging out in this backyard with all this beautiful shrubs and canopy in the background there. And then, of course, a lot of beautiful blooming plants, which, of course, would be used and would benefit a lot of our pollinators. And, of course, the fruit on a lot of these plants oftentimes benefit our birds and our mammals. And, of course, the cover and even nesting opportunities that these different plant coverings provide are ideal. And so this yard is wildlife habitat certified by National Wildlife Federation. It's also a monarch way station. So again, there are opportunities to really join different efforts once you have these plantings in your garden to really benefit wildlife and also share some of the information that you have with others to get them going as well and maybe copying your efforts. So I mentioned earlier that, we have regions. And for those of you in Bexar County, if you can see right here, Bexar County has about 4 ecoregions. This blue is really the number 7 on this big map, which is Edwards Plateau. Hill country, if you live there, you have typically very shallow soils, rocky soils. If you start digging, you hit rock sometimes. You can't, it's hard to dig a big hole. So 4-inch pots are a wonderful thing to find on sale at the nurseries when you're putting in a lot of plants, a lot easier. And actually that applies to all ecoregions. It doesn't matter if you can't dig a big hole or not. 4-inch pots are easy to put in the ground and they cost a lot less if cost is of issue and you have a lot of plants that you need to be putting into your garden. but you can also phase it in over the years. And then over here on the northeast, this kind of light purplish, if you will, is blackland prairies, kind of on the northeast sector. And there you have really black clay soil. And typically, a lot of people who live in this area oftentimes have foundation problems. You know, you'll see cracking in your house because the soil tends to swell and shrink because it's heavy clay. And so this was historically black land, prairies. And so a lot of this has been developed, and so you do want to be very particular on what kinds of plants you put there, because when we do have heavy rains, if you're planting plants I planted a tree one time that wound up growing well for 8 years. And then we had a seriously heavy rainy season, and it essentially drowned my poor plant, my tree. It died after that because there was just too much water around the roots. So in that case, I just had tried it to plant something that really wasn't supposed to be in that ecoregion or that soil. And then we do have a little bit on the kind of the eastern southern edge of Bexar County. We have post oak savanna. Typically you'll know that you have that type of soil with its deep sandy soils. And post oaks, of course, are one of the indicator species. You'll have a lot of post oaks in the area if you're post oak savanna. That's another thing to look for. And then on the southern portion of Bexar County, this yellow that you see here is going to be South Texas Plains. And South Texas Plains, you'll have a lot of thorny plants in the area. Maybe not in your yard, but you can look around, sometimes even just in your neighborhood where some of the native vegetation has been left intact. That's a good way also to kind of try and figure out maybe what kind of soil type you're in. But there you have sandy to loamy type soils. And so a lot of those thorny plants tend to thrive in South Texas Plains soil types. So it is important to know your soil type so that way you get the appropriate plants for your area. And there are a lot of great resource books. I really highlighted the ones they're all great, but my favorites are the Texas Wildscapes book. And the main reason I like that one is because the first edition especially, unfortunately, well, the first edition has everything in it. It has the just basic information, but it also has the complete plant list. And there aren't a lot of books that have there's not available. Yeah, there's not a lot in most books where you have the native plant indicated and the actual value that it has to a lot of our native wildlife. So it correlates the two in the plant list in the first edition. The second edition, we put it on a CD, but unfortunately that CD became non-functional once we bumped up to Windows 10. And unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to be updating it anytime soon. So that's the downside. You don't get the plant list unless you have an older computer pre-Windows 10 that you could use to use that CD or DVD that's included in that book. So that's why the first edition actually would be more valuable, because it has it all printed out. But one of my other favorite books is Native Texas Plants by Sally Wasowski. It's this one kind of in the center here. Let me see if I can point with my arrow. So that one is really one that I have been touting since I started working as an urban biologist 26 years ago, or 27. And this is the second edition. The second edition is really the one that I would encourage you to get if you can find it, because it's a little bit easier to use. It's more user-friendly. You kind of catalog, it's like a little catalog shopping. You just go through that book and you can see a variety of different types of plants, from annuals, perennials, shrubs, to ornamental trees, to trees, and even I think they even have some water plants in there too, aquatic plants. So she and her husband have done a wonderful job of just really highlighting a lot of our native plants that and by now have actually found their way into a lot of our nurseries. So a very, very good book. And then I do also, as far as a field guide, like the Wildflowers of the Texas Hill Country. That's one of my favorite, by Marshall Enquist. And of course, if you love trees, if you want to identify trees, Texas Trees, A Friendly Guide by Paul Cox and Patty Leslie Pastor. These are also really great field guides. Again, all of them are great, but the ones that I tend to really use for gardening and getting plant information that have been most helpful to me definitely are the Texas Wildscapes and the Native Texas Plant by Sally Wasowski. That one really is one of my favorite ones. And then for those of you who, that's for old schoolers like myself, but those of you who are more up to speed with using your iPhone a lot, and thankfully we all are getting there. Of course, using iNaturalist app is a great way to create a project, even for your property. If you have a rural piece of property, you can go ahead and ID by just taking pictures of the plants on your property, uploading it to your project. And oftentimes if you make it public, then you can sometimes get help with identification of the plants that you may have on your property. So that's a great way, if you're not familiar with your plants, to get kind of professional. I say professional because many of the people who spend an enormous amount of time on there are botanists and or biologists who love plants and love to help ID plants. So again, definitely worth looking into. And if you don't know much about iNaturalist, the tutorial at the bottom here, they have some really great, easy tutorial. And I mean, it's really not that difficult. I would encourage you to get your account started on a computer first, and then you can use your iPhone as a tool in the field. As far as types of wildlife, you know, again, I did highlight the fact that a lot of our wildlife here in Texas, you know, I mentioned pollinators, of course, but people don't realize that a lot of our invertebrates, which include a lot of our insects, we have well over 30,000. That's just here in Texas. And of course, they are the foundation of all these other groups of wildlife that we may want to attract to our properties. So amphibians and reptiles, we have about 213 species, native species, birds, about 649 in the state of Texas. That fluctuates sometimes, depending on when some birds cross over from neighboring countries. So, you know, that, and again, you know, that can fluctuate, but mammals, we have about 174. And again, I can't reiterate it enough that our pollinators are just crucial for the landscapes that we see throughout Texas. And without them, we ultimately would see a completely different state. It would not look anything like what we have today. And we, of course, could wind up being impacted dramatically if we don't help our pollinators. And one of the main pollinators that, of course, is needing our help is the monarch. And I'll be touching on that here in just a second. As far as resource books, I like the Scats and Tracks of the Desert Southwest. If you're wanting to identify some of the wildlife that might be visiting your property, especially if you're getting tracks, and even scat, which is poop. But of course, if you're just focused on birds, there's a lot of great resources that are, of course, online as well. So it's and or on your iPhone, readily available, but I tend to still like books. So that's one of the reasons why I do highlight this, because I like having a book with me, because sometimes if you're in the middle of nowhere and you have no internet connection, or it's really bad, you can still rely on a book to help you identify things. I already touched on this, that creating a basic, great urbanized wildscape means that you're providing the basics, and that's food, cover, and nesting sites by the plants that you select, and then adding that water component. So it's a very simple formula. And if you stick with native plants, then you'll have great success. Even if you, and I typically tell people who aren't good with plants, just to focus on the food aspect. How does that plant provide food to a given species? And if you focus on that food component as that plant matures on your property, you'll then subsequently see how other wildlife species may use it as a cover source or as a nesting opportunity. And then adding that water component again is important. So who pollinates in Texas? Believe it or not, bees, our native bees, are our #1 primary pollinator. And then beetles and flies rank #2 and 3. And, you know, butterflies, of course, and hummingbirds, and even bats. If you like tequila, we don't have, you know, West Texas is where that's produced by our pollinating bats over in West Texas. So keep that in mind if you have any land over in West Texas. But unfortunately, we don't have any pollinating bats over here in the Bexar County area. But we do have hummingbirds, of course. And as you can see here, he's got some, he has some pollen on the end of his beak. And then, of course, butterflies like the monarch. And the monarch is really kind of the ambassador of a lot of our pollinators right now, because it is in the limelight as far as being on the decline. And so a lot of individuals, and I will say probably about 10 or 15 years ago, we realized that a lot of our bee population was declining, and we were trying to get individuals, residents, to plant pollinator gardens for bees in particular. But a lot of people were very reluctant to do that because the first thought that they had was, bees means possible sting. So they were associating that together. And so they were very reluctant to do any kind of gardening for bees specifically. So that didn't go over very well. But it's a little bit of a bait and switch, but essentially if we're wanting to help monarchs, then we are kind of asking the same ask, in that we're wanting to have pollinator gardens for a lot of our monarchs. And other pollinators. And of course, you're going to have bees. And thankfully, most of our native bees are what we consider to be solitary bees. They typically don't sting. And so they're really not gregarious for the most part, and they're very docile, so including our bumblebees too. So again, keep that in mind. Most of our native bees are very sweet bees, and the chances of you being stung are very slim. And bees, of course, because they are a primary pollinator in Texas and nationwide and worldwide, they of course pollinate a variety of our forbs, our flowers, and many of those, especially monarchs, their first journey into the U.S. is through Texas, and they come right up the I-35 highway, if you will, right by San Antonio. So again, what we're doing in our yards here in San Antonio can really benefit monarchs. So having those pollinator plants on site is important. So again, allowing those bees to pollinate those flowers is crucial. And then ultimately those plants benefit a lot of our birds. The seed and the fruit that is produced on a lot of these forbs and shrubs and trees that are also all flowering plants at some point in stage in their life, they are providing that valuable nectar for our pollinators and fruit for a lot of other wildlife species, essentially creating that habitat that all wildlife need. Basic monarch needs in Texas is really providing flowering plants. Again, that benefits all pollinators for the nectar. And then the only other ask for monarchs is that they do, and they are very specific to the larval host plant in the milkweed family. So milkweeds in particular are what they typically will lay their eggs on. And so they do require native milkweeds. And I specifically say native because there is the Mexican milkweed, which has been shown to introduce a parasite, and it primarily affects them in the fall. So if you have the Mexican milkweed, you can keep it, but just you almost have to be diligent about starting to cut it back and remove it off the property, like literally put it in the trash, not in your compost pile in the fall. So starting around the beginning of October, you want to cut it back repeatedly. And it's almost like an annual, it just comes right back within a week. So you'll have to be diligent about cutting it back. And then once it blooms in the spring again, it's not a problem, but it's typically in the fall because a lot of our monarchs are heading southbound over to Mexico. And it's during this time frame that they're drawn to the Mexican milkweed. And because of the chemical in the milkweed itself, sometimes it has a certain chemical that initiates egg laying. So if a monarch should be laying eggs, typically they'll die after they lay eggs. So that's something that we don't want them to do because they're supposed to be overwintering in Mexico. But the other problem is that they have found that there is a particular parasite that can also be on the Mexican milkweed that affects a lot of the larvae that are emerging from any egg laying that happens in the fall. So again, a lot of the babies that emerge, they ultimately have wing problems, or they just essentially don't survive because of the parasite. And the parasite is called OE. And the best thing to do is, if you want to learn a little bit more about that, just Google OE and monarchs, and you get a lot more information. But ultimately, and looking at the different seasons, we want to have a variety of different plants blooming in our gardens. That ultimately means that we have beauty, but we also are benefiting our wildlife so that they have something to either nectar on or to feed on in the form of fruit in the spring, in the summer, fall, and winter. And these are just some examples. Antelope horn is also a larval host plant. So of course, for the monarchs, that benefits them. And then in the summer, our native Texas lantana has a great fruit that a lot of birds, as well as pollinators and monarchs, like to nectar on. And then asters asters as well as, that's actually mist flowers, sorry, in the fall, but asters also are a good nectaring source. And then agarita would be in the winter, and it tends to bloom in February. So that's why it's kind of considered a wintering plant. And of course, as you can see, it has a fruit later on that a lot of our birds love as well. So one of the things I wanted to highlight, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, about how our backyards can really benefit a lot of our visiting birds. And I know many of you, of course, love birds, and I didn't realize this until Doug Talame mentioned this in his presentation. That's why, I mean, it was like a huge eye opener for me. Of course, I realized the value of native plants and how they benefit a lot of our wildlife, but I really had no idea until this research was being done, and I apologize, the name is Narango et al. In 2018. She did this research focusing on different birds and what the number of caterpillars that they consumed, or the types of insects that they consumed in order to raise their young in one nesting season. And they found that caterpillars were the number one insect that was used repeatedly. And of course, a caterpillar is soft-bodied. And of course, if you've ever seen a mama bird feed her young, she's just shoving it down in their mouths. So of course, there's no harm done when you shove a caterpillar down your little baby's throat to feed it. And of course, it's packed full of a lot of valuable nutrients. So the thing that shocked me was that for a pair of chickadees to raise their one nest would require 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to be consumed in one nesting season. That to me was just shocking. I didn't know about this. And that just really honed in to me the value of our urban areas, because again, you don't have to have a lot of land to have a pollinator garden. You don't, of course you do want to be specific about planting larval host plants, because of course some species of butterflies require specific plants. A lot of other ones don't, but about 69% of caterpillars or butterflies that lay their eggs, and or moths that lay their eggs, require a particular larval host plant. So it is important to get that information. And nationalwildlifefederation.org has this website. It's their native plant finder. And it does highlight the plants, the types of plants, and the number of butterflies and moths that particular plant supports. So that's really good, valuable data. The only thing I would caution is I've tested it myself, and for my zip code, some of the plants that come up aren't really native to my area. And so it's not perfect is what I'm getting at, but it's a great way if you want to see if a family, a particular plant family, it gives you an idea of how many that plant family hosts, how many butterflies and moths, excuse me, it can host essentially. So again, it's good information, but it's not perfect. That's why Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Research Center, their website, still by far is one of my favorite ones that I rely on heavily whenever I'm doing any kind of data or research. So I still really tout it as my number one. And of course, it's here in Texas. So if you live in Texas, I mean, there's a lot of great value in their plant list.
Judith,
yes, ma'am.
A couple of questions here on this slide. Do chickadees eat monarch caterpillars? Number one.
No.
And also, I didn't think so, but I wanted to confirm. And number two, someone asked, it says in a single nesting season, what does that mean?
A nesting season would be like, in other words, if they have if they're laying eggs, by the time they rear that one nest, they'll be seeking as much as 6,000 caterpillars in a given area to feed to their young, to rear those two. Maybe, I don't know how many eggs chickadees lay off the top of my head. Maybe you can help me out, Patsy.
About 6, and they raise usually 4 of them or more.
So, okay, that's a lot more. Well, that kind of makes a little bit more sense then with that number. But definitely even with 4 birds, I mean, that's a lot of caterpillars that mom and pop have to go out and find. Now, I will tell you, the monarch, of course, does usually invoke a reflex in most birds because of the chemical that it ingests when it is ingesting milkweed plants. So typically it's very kind of foul tasting and can make a bird actually very sick to its stomach. And of course, it'll usually regurgitate it. That one caterpillar, of course, isn't going to survive that, it's dead, but usually birds learn very quickly because of the bright coloration that monarchs have, their caterpillars have, that, oh, that was a bad tasting caterpillar, not going there again. So they typically will look for other caterpillars, but every once in a while monarch caterpillars do get eaten, but the result is not as favorable as when they eat other caterpillars. All right, so again, as a kind of an overview real quick, when you're doing pollinator friendly practices, use native plants. I mentioned that, many times, and hopefully that, is easy to do if you can find some of the local native nurseries that we have here in Bexar County and surrounding, or depending on where you're located at. You want to have things, of course, that are blooming continuously from early spring to early fall. That's why we recommend starting out with at least 3 blooming plants in the spring and on all the different seasons. Believe it or not, even provide some bare ground in your gardens or on your property, because a lot of our native birds are ground nesting birds. We have deadwood nesting bees. I'm sorry, I said birds. Deadwood nesting bees. And we also have ground nesting bees, native bees. And so a lot of times they like a little bit of a slant if it's on the ground, because when there's rainfall, it kind of, they'll have one little opening as their little, I guess, nest, if you will. And so when they're in there, they want the rainfall to kind of slough down the side of a hill or embankment. It doesn't have to be deep or it just has to be a shallow embankment. Typically they aren't at the bottom of an area. So, if you can leave some soil exposed on any hillsides that you may have, that will help a lot of our native bees find bare ground to nest in. And then let's see, you can also do like a bird bath and add soil in that bird bath to offer a place where a lot of our adult butterflies can gain minerals. So again, use native soil. Don't use anything that is from the nursery that might have any kind of chemicals in it. Again, the idea is that usually if it gets just sprinkled with a little bit of water, oftentimes those nutrients, those minerals will percolate up to the top of the soil, and typically you'll have that puddling from a lot of our butterflies. Of course, it goes without saying to avoid chemical use in your garden if you can allow the natural system to work, where you have birds coming in and serving kind of as that pest control potentially. I mean, it's the web of life, so they all get to eat. And then, of course, let's see, have larval host plants and avoid modern hybrids. And the only reason I say that is bigger doesn't necessarily mean better. Sometimes you can have like a huge hibiscus versus the native hibiscus that we may have, that it's got a huge bloom but offers nothing in the way of nectar. So bigger again doesn't mean better, but sometimes in the nursery trade they do go for looks. So just be aware of that, and try to choose some natives even if you add some of the hybrids in. Lady Bird Johnson, as I mentioned, is one of my favorite, and of course Native Texas Plants by Sally Wasowski. These are really the online version of Lady Bird Johnson, and if you want a book, those are my top 2 favorites, because they do provide information on the spacing of a plant and the light conditions. And the only thing I really want to emphasize there is that when you are putting plants in the ground, consider and know their height at maturity. So if you're putting a plant in that's going to be about 3 feet tall, typically speaking, it needs about 3 foot of spacing. A shrub that may get 6 foot tall needs about 6 foot of spacing. That means if you think about the center of that plant, if I'm a plant that is going to be 8 foot tall when I mature, that means I need to have 4 foot of spacing all the way around me. So if I put my fingers out, or from fingertip to fingertip will be 8 feet, and I need to be planted so that I have 4 feet all the way around me. So you don't want to plant me closer to a building. Like you don't want to plant me 2 feet away from a building, because then I'm just going to really be growing into the building, and it creates a maintenance nightmare. Or if you have multiple plants, you don't want them really necessarily growing into each other unless that is the look you're going for. But most of us in urban areas especially, we want to have a garden that looks appealing and that looks kind of behaved and not too wild. And so oftentimes if you give each plant its space initially, and then you find that you have gaps between those plants, then at that point it's a lot easier to add more plants to fill in those voids than it is to have planted everything so closely together that it's a maintenance nightmare and you're having to constantly prune things back, and then they start looking unnatural in their growth habit. So keep that in mind. But these two resources offer that spacing information. I threw in I'm not going into a lot of plants since I'm giving you a lot of plant resources, but I just had to throw in these two plants only because salvias, it's, if you've never gardened, just picking a salvia of any kind, as long as it's native, you can't go wrong. And Salvia coccinea is one of my favorites because you can buy this in seed form. And especially if you have an area that is somewhat shady on your property, and you have a hard time growing anything, you can throw this out by seed during the appropriate time in the fall, and right before rainfall, hopefully, and just let it come up. Now it is considered it can be considered as a ground cover, but as you see in the picture, it's not low growing. I mean, it's not like you can be walking around on this and not have an effect on it. But it does serve a nice ground cover in the sense that it will be tall and full, and it gets about 2 foot in height typically. Again, it does really well in poor soils and in shady conditions. And so it will do well in the hill country, blackland prairie soil types, and in South Texas plain soil types. That's what the HC, BLP, and the S South Texas means. So again, a great plant to get started with if you really are having issues on your property. You can just sow it by seed. It's cheaper that way, and just see, how it fares. And it of course draws in a ton of hummingbirds and butterflies because of the fact that they love the nectar. And then this is another salvia that I just wanted to mention. It's more of a shrub. It's autumn sage or Salvia greggii. And the other thing too to keep in mind when you're looking at plant lists, always write down the scientific name of a plant so that you get the right plant, because one plant or each plant has only one scientific name associated with it, but yet it can have maybe 5 different common names. And so if you go into a nursery or you go somewhere and ask for the common name, you might wind up with a completely different plant than what you intended to get. So if you have the scientific name, which is usually italicized or underlined, then that oftentimes will get you the right plant when you're going to the nursery if you've looked it up and want that particular plant. But Salvia greggii is a 4-foot shrub, maybe 5 foot in some cases, but usually 4 foot. Has a variety of different colors because the nursery trade has created these different colors, but red is usually the most popular, and will make sure that, it's assuredly will get you hummingbirds and butterflies nectaring on it. So it does tend to become kind of woody after the second year. So if you're not cutting back some of your shrubs at the end of every winter, then oftentimes you can cut it back in July. That's always a good time to cut plants back to allow new growth to come forward and throw out some new blooms. So around late July is a good time to do that. But if you're doing that in the summer, make sure that you leave at least about 1 foot of material on that particular plant. Don't cut it all the way down to the ground like you would at the end of winter. Instead, leave about 1 foot of growth on it, and then it'll come back typically with new blooms, and it won't be quite as woody. Okay, so they say teach a man to fish and you feed him forever. And so instead of going through a lot of plants, there are a ton of plant lists out there. I just wanted to again emphasize the different resources that are available where you can find plant lists that may suit your needs. Most of them are very easy to follow. My first and foremost one, of course, is wildflower.org. That's Lady Bird Johnson's Wildflower Center, because again, it's in Texas, and they focus on Texas plants. But if you're out of state, or if you own property out of state, they also have plant lists for out of state areas as well. But again, my favorite by far. And then they do have a collection of those various plant lists. And then Native Plant Society of Texas is another great resource. They also have plant lists for different parts of the state. So depending on where you're living, where your property is, you can also find a great resource there. NRCS, the nrcsUSDA.gov, that one also has a really good plant list. It offers a variety of a lot of these different plans offer different information. If you've got rural land, that's a really good website as a resource, more than it would be for maybe backyard habitat. But it still offers great information. So again, I would definitely check these other websites. Audubon.org has a really great plant list as well. You can type in your zip code and you get a plant list for birds specifically. So definitely, if you didn't know about that, that's definitely worth checking out. And then I've already mentioned the National Wildlife Federation.org website here. And I apologize. Well, I just am now realizing this, but I have this little bar that I've been moving around on my screen, and I hope y'all aren't seeing that because I've been blocking some of the information. I hope that's not the case. I hope you're just seeing my slides. But anyway, I apologize. So nationalwildlifefederation.org, the native plant finder, that's the website that it's not ideal 100% for Texas, but it will give you at least the number of different butterflies and moths that use a particular plant as a larval host plant. So it gives you a really good idea of, is it 16 different species? Oaks, for instance, is 486 or 468 different butterflies and moths use a variety of different oaks as a larval host plant. Didn't know that. So I just recently found that out. So again, that was very eye-opening to me. We all love oaks, but I didn't realize how valuable they were as a source of caterpillar food source for a lot of our birds. So keep that in mind. And this just highlights just some of the different collections on Lady Bird Johnson's Wildflower Center website. As you can see here, there's the Texas Wildscapes, and it is interactive. So you can type in if you have shady conditions, if you're looking for certain flowering plants in certain seasons, you can click off these little, they're little check boxes on the right-hand side on that plant list. And so you can essentially create a plant list specific to your needs. So that's one of the reasons I love this website as well, because it is interactive in a sense. But again, I'm not going to get into it too much because I know I'm running out of time. This is a list of nurseries that that I created for the San Antonio area. And I apologize. I think, unfortunately, Schultz Nursery, I didn't take that one off. I may have needed to update that. But in any case, regardless of which nursery that you visit, make sure that there are no neonicotinoids that are being used at the nursery. Make sure you ask staff, because the problem is a lot of these plants, if they have neonicotinoids that were used on them, especially the milkweeds, the problem is that you're planting essentially a plant that has a poison that will ultimately kill a caterpillar once it devours that plant. So that's the only downside. Well, that's a big downside to plants that are being treated with that. So you want to be assured that what you're planting in your garden is safe for wildlife to devour and to eat and to live in. And of course, planting in the fall is ideal because a lot of times you get those fall savings too, because a lot of nurseries want to get rid of their plant stock before winter arrives. I just want to also emphasize the texasinvasives.org. For those of you that may be considering planting some non-native plants, just make sure it's not on this list so that you're not introducing an invasive species. Believe it or not, a lot of people don't realize, for instance, Nandina is on the list. So it's one that birds do like to eat the fruit on, but it can be spread quite easily by the birds themselves into neighboring natural areas. Same thing with Chinaberry, another highly invasive plant. And unfortunately there, it finds its way a lot of times in our riparian areas, and plants crop up. They then drop their seed into the waterways, and then they get spread all along the riparian embankments. And then, it just becomes a nightmare. And becomes a monoculture stand oftentimes over time. So just keep that in mind. Again, small spaces anywhere with native plants can help a variety of wildlife. And I apologize. I know I am running out of time here, so I'm going to go very quickly through water. Again, any kind of water is ideal for wildlife, but do keep in mind the safety. Bees, a lot of our native bees do need water as well. So if you can, have a slight slant to your water source, so it's not just an immediate drop off, so they can kind of crawl down to the water's edge and get what they need. And or you can add on the, like in the right image, you can add pebbles into the bird bath if you do have a deep one, and that makes it a lot more water friendly for a lot of our pollinators to utilize. On the very bottom, even if you're doing water catchment systems, just make sure that it's safe for wildlife. You can put a screen on it if you don't want mosquitoes to be an issue. But if it is open, you know, if you have like mosquito dunk, you can add it, and that'll usually retard any mosquito larvae from forming, and it's not harmful to birds. But as you can see in the middle image here, putting cinder blocks in there and then adding a beautiful accent rock to the middle is all you need to allow birds to land and get to the water's edge. And that way, if they do happen to fall in, they have a way of getting out of that deep water source as well. And even bats, really, and other wildlife, if you have something like a trough out in a rural area, or you have something even on your own property in an urban setting, these metal ramps allow wildlife to get out safely, regardless of how deep that water source is. This is a metal ramp, and it goes all the way down to the bottom of the trough. So if a bat, which tends to drink on the wing, if for some reason it fell in, it could have a way of getting out, and then it would have to wind up getting up to the edge here. And bats, unfortunately, don't fly from the ground up. They would have to drop and fly. So if you do find a bat near a water source, if you can, take a stick and elevate it onto a neighboring tree trunks to allow that bat to later drop and fly once it dries off and recuperates from its escape from the trough. But that would be the best thing you could do to help a bat that you may find near a water source. And then shallow sources, of course, everywhere throughout the garden is very beneficial. This is kind of what I was talking about. Puddling, butterflies do that. And the bird bath on the right has this, just some natural sand or dirt that you can moisten it occasionally. Again, just make sure it does not have potting soil in it, because that tends to have chemicals in it. And that will also help a lot of our butterflies, including our monarchs. And then if you do put a permanent pond in, just make sure it does not receive direct runoff, because you don't want chemicals from neighbors' properties winding up into your water source. So that's the main reason you don't really want to have direct runoff going into it. And then provide shallow areas, like you can see here on the water's edge. There's some rock that's above the water level. And that, again, is for any wildlife that may accidentally fall into the deeper areas. They can find their way out by climbing onto the edge of the rock that is exposed and above ground, but still somewhat submersed in some areas. And so that is the end of my presentation. Again, you know, create that diversity in your urban areas. I mean, and I would highly encourage you to also listen to Doug Tallamy if you haven't heard one of his talks. Very enlightening, and again, he speaks the same message that we all are trying to share with various Texas residents, in that we really want us to try and make some changes in our urban lots, especially because we can do that. It's a small area. Most of us love to garden, thankfully, and you know, whatever you call it, habitat creation or gardening, it's the same thing if you're putting in the correct plants. And that's my contact information again.
And I assume that you would be able to, if people wanted to contact you with specific questions, they could do that with this. Okay. And thank you, Judith. Goodness gracious, that was wonderful. I would like to point out to the people here that we have recorded this session, and in a day or so, it will be posted on the Bear Audubon Society website. It's under our meetings, and it says, in case you missed it. And we didn't say this, but in case you want to see it again, or there's a part of it you want to see again, it'll be available. And we'll also, if you want access to the chat, we have that. So you can contact us and we'll be happy to do it. A lot of people, I want to thank the people in the audience who have fielded some of the questions for us, so that we have, before we go into more questions, I do have it's my fault, I left out, we have another program that I'd like Nicole McLeod from San Antonio Parks and Wildlife. Can you unmute yourself and tell us about the program that's coming up?
Okay, sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Judith. I love attending your talks. So Wendy Gordon is a consultant out of Austin, and she's given a talk before on climate change. And I believe she just started I'm not sure if she posted her new website yet. I think it's climateaction.com or .org. I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, but she does have a PhD in environmental science, and she is an independent consultant now. She's worked on so many different projects, but you all are welcome to attend. It is free, and you just, the Bear Audubon has the link on their page. And I also put it in the chat box, and so you have access to that. So if you have any trouble finding that link, you're welcome to email me or Patsy. And that's it. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank
Okay, let me see here.
you.
So we're going to, Judith, would you stop your share on your screen?
I sure do.
Did you already do that?
I did.
Okay, good. Okay, there you are. For some reason, we were all black and I didn't know what happened. Okay, we have a couple of things. There's a lot of information here that I want to thank people for adding, like National Audubon has a Plants for Birds website, and you put in your zip code and it gives you a whole list of plants, and it tells you which insects, pollinators, and which birds it benefits. So it's kind of a short version, but it'll give you specific to your zip code. Now, there were a couple of questions, and you might want to address this at the end here. With the recent deep freeze that we had, we have a lot of plants that look like they've had it, but and some of them have, I'm sure. But can you give us just a general guidelines of what we should do and shouldn't do? Should we wait a while to see what's going to happen, and should we go start trimming now, or what should we do?
Typically, usually you would want to keep anything above ground actually helps the roots during the winter months. So, you know, if we anticipate another freeze, which I don't think we're going to have typically here in Texas and San Antonio, usually mid-February is kind of like the end of it. You know, we'll oftentimes, if we're going to have a freeze, it seems to always happen in the middle of February, and then we have a bad one, and then it's over for the rest of the time. But, you know, waiting, I mean, we're almost at the end of the month now, and at this point, I don't think we're going to have any more freezes. I hope, but you can go ahead and cut things back at this point, because you're at the end of winter, and you can go ahead and cut things down to the ground. The roots, if the plant is still alive, once things warm up, things will start to come back on their own. If it's a plant that really just didn't survive the freeze that we had, this horrible freeze, then you may have to replant, and you'll know it just won't come back.
Okay. Thank you. That's good, because a lot of people walked out and went, where'd they go? But native plants, as you pointed out, are very tough, and they a lot of times will kind of go dormant for a while, and then they'll come back when it starts to warm up and so forth. So wonderful information and wonderful resources. So if you go back to anybody in our audience who goes back and looks at those, stop the program right there, write those down. And Doug Ptolemy's books are just, they're gospel. And it's required reading for anyone who's interested in providing habitat for wildlife. So thank you for coming and giving us all that good information. And next, 2 weeks from now, it's going to be spring already. Oh, and one other thing, Angel Poe, who's the education specialist at Mitchell Lake, put in the chat how to get more information about the birdathon and the virtual, and it's all on the Mitchell Lake website. So thank you again. Anybody has any last questions that you'd like to unmute and ask? We have just a few minutes left before we turn into pumpkins.
If I could just also just emphasize, we do have a city nature challenge coming up at the end of April.
Yes,
So,
we do.
If you have not ever done iNaturalist, now's the time to get trained online. And or there will be some workshops probably around the city that will pop up too. So keep an eye out on that. But
Well-
it's really a fun opportunity to just kind of share what you see by just taking pictures and uploading it to the iNaturals for this challenge.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I didn't mention everything that we have coming up in April, but it is in our newsletter that just went
Awesome.
out, and
Thank
it's
you.
on our website. And Craig Hensley did an iNaturalist workshop for us just recently, and we have a link to that workshop on our website. So you can take it from online. And if you have any questions, just email us at bearaudubon.org. And we'll try to, if we don't know the answer, we'll find somebody that does, and we'll get you hooked up. So thanks for mentioning that. And we have a couple of really good programs in April. One is about where to go birding during the great, or where to go during the great in San Antonio area, the San Antonio Parks and Wildlife. And we have a wonderful book author, a children's book about birds and their importance. So go to the website, go to all these wonderful websites and check them out, and keep adding every time. You can't learn it all at once. It's like drinking from a fire hose. We have to take small sips, and we keep learning all the time. So everyone, thank you so much for coming. And Judith, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. And everybody, stay happy, stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you along the naturalist path. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.